and happy Valentine's Day. Let's think about chocolate. And the chocolate that I want to think with you about tonight, I want to drill back into the very, very deep history of chocolate and talk about chocolate before Columbus and really the first connoisseurs of chocolate. That's what we'll be talking about tonight. So I will focus the bulk of my lecture on the classic Maya period, but we'll talk about a bit about what happened and how chocolate was consumed before the classic period and also more recently. And since the name of Christopher Columbus is in my lecture, and of course he's a person that has recently been talked much about on this campus, let's start with Christopher Columbus. And during his fourth voyage to the Americas in 1502, Columbus actually, he was in the Bay of Honduras sailing about, and he spotted and boarded a large cargo canoe that was carrying, amongst other things, sacks of chocolate beans. And we have from his chronicler one of the first descriptions of chocolate that the Western world heard of, and his chronicler described it as small almond bean types of little beans, which is almendros de cacao, is how it's come down to us. And we come to understand that chocolate, in a sense, is indigenous America's gift to the world. We know it's spread all over the place. But during the colonial period that ensued in Mexico and Guatemala, after Columbus discovered the Americas, the practice of drinking cacao, which is the old way in which cacao was consumed, not as a hard brick chocolate, but as a chocolate drink, and really without any sugar and without any milk. So we have from colonial Guatemala all sorts of really interesting early accounts that moved through the colonial period of cacao, of chocolate drinking, and how it was considered an aphrodisiac. There's one really wonderful account from 1695, I believe it was, of an allegation of witchcraft that a man lodged against his wife because preparing the cacao drink every morning was such a gendered activity that he kind of woke up and realized that he was the one getting up and preparing the cacao in the morning. And he figured that he must have been bewitched for this to have happened. So the notion of women being the preparers of cacao and pourers of the chocolate drink, it's something that we'll return to again and again through the course of this talk. Very interesting connection between women and chocolate, and of course that undoubtedly has some significance in terms of the romantic links between St. Valentine's Day and chocolate and the way that that's come down to us. There was also a very interesting discussion in early colonial times as to whether or not drinking chocolate constituted a breaking of the fast before, if you were Catholic, before you went to Mass. In olden days, were required to fast for an hour or greater. And cacao was considered to be, so there's a discussion, is it food, is it a drink, is it something that is such a fundamental type of sustenance that it is not really considered to be breaking the fast to drink it before you go to Mass, and then even during Mass, sort of noble women would have cacao brought to them. So, and it was prepared in jar-like pitchers that you see shown here. The chocolate will be poured in, water added, chocolate powder, and then a kind of swizzle stick used to froth it up. So foaming the chocolate and getting a good head on it was an important part of preparing chocolate. The chocolate then, I think 1595, is the first recorded shipment of the chocolate bean to a European port, to a Spanish port. And chocolate then became very popular in the Spanish court. So Spanish nobles began to drink it. Mesoamerican nobles, the Aboriginal indigenous nobles of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, had drunk it for a very long time, as you'll soon learn. But then it became very popular in the courts of Europe. And then it started in Spain and then spread to France with the marriage of Anne to the future King Louis XIII. They're both very young, as you can see from the image on the left there. And then a wonderful quote about 50 years later, when another Spanish princess by the name of Maria Teresa married the Sun King Louis XIV, and she is quoted as saying, "Chocolate and the king are my two passions." And so it became wildly popular in European courts, and initially restricted to nobility, and then chocolate shops, places to drink chocolate began to crop up in cities, and chocolate drinking became more widely disseminated, but initially was just restricted to nobility. So then we have the invention of chocolate as a hard candy, as a confectionery. And this is really an innovation that took place in Europe. This was a kind of concoction of European chemists that took place in the late 18th and then into the 19th century. And there, 1879 is reportedly the date of the first milk chocolate hard candy bar that was created by a Swiss chemist, Daniel Peter. So we see the transition then where chocolate goes from being a beverage, which may or may not be sweetened, to a confectionery, a candy, with sugar being added to it and milk often being added to it, and then all sorts of emulsifiers added to so that it would stay stable in a hard brick-like form. And then, of course, a little bit earlier in the Americas, the chocolate factory up in Milton, Mass, that was started by Baker in the late 18th century, and that was the first chocolate processing plant in New England. And I was just looking at something this afternoon that Geraldine showed me about an early chocolate processing plant in this neighborhood here in Rhode Island, and that is there's talk of renovation of it, and so that it can be toured. So you see, as all of the early mills in New England are always placed next to rivers as their source of power, really, to run whatever needed to be run inside the factories. So we have then hard chocolate becoming very popular. And of course, as a child, I grew up on Hershey chocolate, Hershey's Kisses. And there's a very interesting history to Hershey, the Hershey plant in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was established in the late 19th century as a utopian community and a factory, really. And so housing was built, all sorts of playgrounds were built, schools were built. It was a complete kind of a living package for the people who worked there on the plant line. You see the image here in the lower left-hand corner. And it also in the rest of Hershey, Pennsylvania here. So it was really a very enlightened kind of operation. And interestingly enough, Hershey will continue to have an impact on the story that I'm going to have a presence in the story that I'm going to tell tonight, because a Hershey chemist by the name of Jeffrey Hurst has been responsible for isolating theobromine in the fabric of ancient pottery from everywhere from the Maya area all the way up to Chaco Canyon. And then I will also be talking to you about the research that I've been doing in a cacao-producing valley in Belize and central Belize. And one of the sites in that valley had the pre-existing name, it was already on the site register rolls, as the Hershey site, because it had been owned for a while by Hershey Chocolate. So it literally is pyramids in the middle of a forest of chocolate trees. So we'll be returning to Hershey a couple more times through the course of this talk. Okay, well, I was standing in the checkout line waiting to buy some groceries the other day, and I took a look at Martha Stewart's February issue of Living, and lo and behold, we are still in love with chocolate. That was the headline, in love with chocolate. I don't think that really comes as any surprise to anyone. So it's still a topic that's very much on everyone's mind, 75 different recipes. And then I was looking for some specific images of women pouring chocolate. These are older images from codices and polychrome roll-ups from the Maya Classic period. And I came upon a number of very interesting and pretty risque images of women pouring chocolate. So I don't know, depending on what you're looking for, whether you want to Google that or not, but the theme of women pouring chocolate, and this is, of course, a woman pouring chocolate in the 21st century here, but we'll be returning to this theme as my talk progresses. But certainly we hear that chocolate is now, that it's heart healthy, that it raises serotonin levels, that it has also, in addition to the sort of legendary properties of being an aphrodisiac, it has a lot of serious beneficial health effects, especially if it's not taken with copious amounts of sugar, which certainly was the way that it was consumed in the past without a lot of sweetener. Okay, well, it ends up that the cacao tree itself is kind of an interesting thing. You'll see, this is one of the cacao trees growing in the Hershey orchard, and you might, if you're a northeastern person, you immediately look at it and say, that's kind of a funny-looking fruiting habit. The way that the pods develop directly from the trunk of the tree and not from the end of the limbs. And it's pollinated, this is typical tropical pollination scheme. It's pollinated by this one species of a midge that flies from flower to flower and cross-pollinates. And so it's kind of a delicate little tropical understory tree. It's been hybridized like crazy, even as much as or more than corn, for instance, has been hybridized. But as the wild species, the sort of early domestics of cacao are kind of delicate and easily sort of insect prone, and they can be, there's some various kinds of rot and things that can develop. So that's the pod. You see the pod right here, and then you see the seeds here. This kind of white, creamy, pulpy stuff that's in between the seeds. It's very sweet. It's very refreshing. It's good to eat. So if you're hungry, you're not in a tropical forest, and you see a cacao tree, you can just open the pod, and this white pulpy stuff is very refreshing if you don't have your water source with you. Now, if you're a botanist and you're searching for the sort of trying to figure out where cacao was domesticated and where cacao originates from, the botanists tell us that the most wild species of cacao-like trees exist in the Amazon. Okay, and then as you move north, there's fewer and fewer varieties of cacao. And when we get up into this area that we'll be focusing on tonight, the Maya area, this is southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and western Honduras, it's not really clear whether any wild cacao ever existed there or not. So it might have all been introduced. But the funny thing is, if you're out in the forest, walking around, and you're in an area where it doesn't really look like anyone has been doing any cultivation of anything for maybe the last 100 years, you can stumble upon a cacao tree with cacao pods and everything. And so the question then becomes, are those trees really wild, or are they kind of feral trees that had one point in time been planted, or maybe their mothers or grandmothers had been planted, and then they were just spontaneously sort of continuing to generate, because cacao does not seem to be that dependent upon human manipulation. The interesting thing is that in the Amazon, indigenous peoples do use the pulp, this sweet white material that's fermented and into some very nice drinks, but they don't really do too much with the seeds. And it's only when we get up here into our region in the northern part of Central America that we begin to see a lot more attention to the actual cacao seed. This is a walk that, this is a result of a walk we were taking in the Cebu Valley. Kristen Triplett is a botanist, and Juan Shum, who was leading us, and to a cacao tree that he knew of that was in the middle of nowhere, and we walked for hours and got to it, and then here's one of the pods that was growing on it. So the question of exactly how that tree came to be there is something that botanists themselves aren't completely in agreement on. And here's the seeds being processed on a concrete pad in front of a house. This is Miss Toon turning the seeds over to make sure that they're drying evenly in preparation for her family will consume some of it, and some of it will be sold. So it's interesting with these small-scale family productions of cacao, you often see these drying pads right in front of the house, because cacao is a pretty precious commodity, and people want to keep an eye on that drying area. So that's something that archaeologists would look at this sort of thing, oh, that's very interesting. They're drying the cacao very proximate to the house, and maybe those features would occur archaeologically. Well, this is southern Belize. We sometimes refer to it as the Toledo district. And if you go into that area today, there's lots of cacao trees. And you might even be able to persuade an older Mopan Maya woman or Quechua Maya woman, this is Mrs. June, to prepare cacao for you the old-fashioned way. And you can see that she's grinding up the cacao beans using a stone mano and metate. And then this is what she starts with, this. These are the cacao beans. And then in southern Belize, they like to add, and this is not something that existed in the Maya world before Europeans, they like to add black pepper to their cacao. So maybe a little bit of sugar, not much. Black pepper, some cornmeal or corn masa, and drink that. It's a very pungent drink. And what is not used locally, and much of it is grown to be sold, the British candy company, Green and Blacks, has entered into a fair trade agreement with the Maya people of southern Belize. And this is organic cacao, and that was pretty easily established because when Green and Black came into the area a decade or so ago, they said, well, you know, we want to sell your cacao as organic cacao, but we have to demonstrate that you haven't used any chemical fertilizers or pesticides, you know, for X number of years in order for it to be certified as organic. And the local cacao farmers said, well, that's easy. We really can't afford to buy any chemical fertilizers or pesticides, and so we've just been doing the best we can with, you know, like kind of local ways to fight infestation of insects and keep the trees healthy and productive. And so it is organic cacao, and it is fair trade. And so this is kind of one of the happy stories of something that was one of the food items that was found in the Americas and then shared with the rest of the world, but still does provide a livelihood for people in the Maya area in particular, in southern Belize. Okay, let's go way back in time now and think about the first chocolate drinking vessels. And a lot of what we understand about chocolate in the Maya region is based on And what we find, either hieroglyphic text painted on the pottery vessels or residue chemically isolated from within the pottery vessels. And what we have found for the pre-classic period, this period from 1000 BC to about 80 to 50, is that the chocolate drinking vessels, or chocolate preparation vessels, we're not sure if people were actually drinking out of these, were these so-called spouted vessels. And you can see that these are, each one looks a little bit different. These are not like vessels that were made in any sort of like stamped out fashion. Each one of these vessels, and they come from many different sites. I happen to be showing you three from a site that I excavated in northern Greece called Cacao. They're always very distinctive vessels, and they're always found in burials of very distinctive individuals. And so this so-called, This one that we call the duck pot, this is the head of a Muscovy duck, and the so-called spout is the tail. Was found right here, and this is a burial of an older male and another vessel that was with that individual. This miniature spouted vessel comes from this burial, which was a very complex burial. It almost seemed like a family ossuary with a series of individuals of a lot of different ages placed in sequential interments over time. And this one was actually associated with an older female. And so we have, an interesting way that all these very, very distinctive looking vessels and in very distinctively marked interments of special persons. Now, the interesting thing about the spouts on these vessels is that we call them spouts, but they're totally non-functional as spouts. Some of you who are engineers might have been looking at these spouts and thinking, well, the spout is so vertical, how would you really pour? Because by the time you got something to come out of the spout, it would also be coming out of the top of the vessel. And to my horror, some of my graduate students actually tested this, and we filled the vessels up with water, and then we found that we couldn't pour out of them without using the spout. And so what it seems is though the spout was used for, excuse me, hitting the wrong button, that it had something to do with frothing, that it was almost more of a straw that it might have blown into the vessel through the long tube-like spout in order to froth it up. So that was an interesting form, but for some reason that form went out of style. It became unfashionable around 80 to 50, and other forms began to take its place. And other things began to happen. Cacao began to be, in the early classic period, starting about 80 to 50, cacao was very associated with royalty, and we get for the first time the actual hieroglyph, the Maya hieroglyph for cacao. And this was deciphered by David Stewart, along with help with some of his colleagues, including Steve Houston, who's here in the room. And here it is, the hieroglyph for cacao. For many years, my co used to refer to this glyph as the fish glyph, because you can see it's like a side profile of a fish with the gills and everything. And then the two dots here indicating that this syllable ka, it should be repeated twice, ka, and then the wa, this is how this is read back here. So you have cacao wa, and then the last A, the last vowel being dropped, and it becomes cacao. And you can see over here a different kind of spelling of cacao with the actual ka could also be written as a thing that looks like a cone to us. So that would be ka, and then the wa is underneath the head rather than behind the head. And so this is, it's a fabulous thing. And it's the earliest example that we have of the cacao glyph. And just like those pre-classic vessels I was showing you, it comes from a burial. This one is a very fancy burial of a royal person from a site called Bir Azul in the the northeastern part of the Petén of Guatemala. And you can see that this person was buried in, there was a hollowed out chamber, painted and everything. It's a really extravagant kind of sending facility to send someone off to the afterlife. This top on this vessel, let me go back just 1 minute, is an actual screw top, which is very unusual. We don't have too many examples of that from the Maya region. But that also facilitated, because there was a tightly fitting lid on it, the brown residue in the bottom was actually visible, and Jeffrey Hurst, the Hershey chemist, was able to isolate theobromine from the residue in the bottom. So it was a very nice, happy coincidence of the residue matching up with what the hieroglyph on the vessel. Now, as we move into the late classic period, the vessels, it's a different style again. A tall, thin, cylindrical vessel becomes the most typical or popular form for a vessel that would be used for the frothing and pouring, or perhaps even the drinking of cacao. And these vessels have what Michael originally called a primary standard sequence of glyphs around the band here. And we now know from deciphering the code that these are pretty standard, that they're kind of dedicatory, and they name the person who was the possessor of the vessel and the vessel contents. And so if you look down here, this is sorry, I keep hitting that. This is a rollout of that band of glyphs, and you might be able to find the cacao glyph right here. You really can't see, it's not one of the glyphs shown here, it's on the back side. So here's the cacao glyph here, and then interestingly enough, there's also the name of the individual who is said to have been the possessor. This is his vessel. And it's Tactili, the Holy Lord of a site that we call today Naranjo, which is just right on the border between Guatemala and Belize. And the site of Naranjo is indicated with these cross bands right here, which I'll show you another example of in a little while, so keep that in mind. Now, the interesting or the tragic thing is that these vessels, you can imagine, they have, here, this is a dancing scene on it, but they often have courtly presentation scenes on them, they have hieroglyphs on them, they're highly portable, so they were very much the Maya sites through the 70s and the 80s, and to some extent still today, although it seems to have tapered off a bit. And so this particular vessel that I'm showing you here was excavated archaeologically. And so we know that it was excavated, it comes from the burial of a young, kind of secondary lord, young prince, sort of, from a site in western Belize, in the Belize River Valley, called Buena Vista del Cayo. But it names the possessor of this vessel as the ruler of a completely different site called Naranjo. And so we begin to get a glimpse here of how these vessels moved around as gift and gifting, and maybe to cement alliance relationships between sites. And so we come to understand that what is written on the vessel may not actually indicate where the vessel's final resting place archaeologically. So it's a little bit more complex than that. And then we also find that there are other vessel forms that either contain cacao residue or they contain the cacao glyph, but they are not these tall, thin, cylindrical vessels. They don't seem to be the kind of thing that you would pick up and drink from. They're more the lot or the kind of shallow dish form right here from whole wool. This vessel contains a cacao glyph. And this is another cylindrical vessel, but a very short one, with a wider diameter, also with a preserved lid, with cacao residue in it. And so it seems that some of these vessels contained other variations on on cacao cuisine other than simply the cacao drink. So they might have contained a version of a kind of a mole, you know, the chocolate chile sauce, or they might have contained tamales that might have had some cacao in the inside of them, or something or another. There's just simply looking at the cuisine of this area is really interesting because there are all these really flavorful sauces made from crushed pumpkin seeds and different kinds of the use of not only herbs that we don't use that commonly up here, but using things like pumpkin seeds and chocolate and things like that for sauces. And when the Sophie Coe has written a book about this, and she talks about the some of the conquistadors when they were being traveling around from royal court to royal court in the 16th and 17th centuries, and you know that they were being feted and really fed the very best cuisine of the royal court, but they kept complaining that it was perpetual Lent because they were these standards and they wanted these big cuts of beef. That's what, you know, they wanted to be served, and they were being served these sort of delicate sauces with maybe a little venison in it. It was just not really satisfying in any appetites. And so we have a little glimpse there into Mesoamerican cuisine and how it was, probably by today's standards, a pretty healthy, well-balanced kind of cuisine with, you know, with lots of interesting sauces, not a lot of meat. Okay, let's get back to women pouring chocolate. Here's a scene, it's a very famous scene from a pottery vessel that shows actually it's an underworld scene. But here's a Maya woman who is pouring chocolate from one cylindrical vessel to another, frothing it up. And then we have, so that's late classic Maya, and then we have another famous scene from the Highlands, post-classic early colonial Nawa woman from the Codex Tudela, who is pouring chocolate to and fro in order to froth it up. And so I think that if any of you have ever visited Japan or China or been part of a Japanese tea ceremony, and the protocol and the way in which the woman serves the tea, mixes up the tea, and then serves it, I think along those lines for how chocolate was prepared and presented in late classic Maya royal courts and in other royal courts throughout Mesoamerica. In answer to the question, what was the social context in which cacao was drunk? Was it something people drank every day? Certainly, if you were a wealthy ruler, you might be drinking cacao every day. But for many people, it was something that was reserved for special anniversary events, for births, for weddings, for coronations, for sort of critical rites of passage events that took place. And one of the most wonderful descriptions that we have of cacao drinking at a royal court, at a late classic Maya royal court, comes from a site that Professor Houston himself worked at, Piedras Negras, and it is a description of, you can't see this very well here, but there's a throne, and there's a ruler sitting on the throne, and some subsidiary rulers that are sitting at the base. You can see there's a cacao, the tall cylindrical vessel right here, and a long text accompanying it, hieroglyphic text that mentions a nighttime event with a descending cacao dance, and a descending macaw dance, which is the parrot. So it's like, decked out in feathers, a descending macaw dance, and cacao drinking. So as part, this was an anniversary ceremony, the anniversary of commemorating a previous ruler. So those are the contexts within the royal courts in which cacao might be drunk. Okay, well, so I think we've established through the hieroglyphs and through detection of cacao residue in vessels that there was a very healthy appetite for cacao for chocolate drinking at Royal Maya, at Classic Maya Court, the Royal Courts. But where did they get their cacao from? Could they just grow it in their backyard? Or were they importing it from other areas? How far away did they have to bring it in from? This map shows some of the prime cacao producing areas in the east, what we call the eastern part of Mesoamerica, or the Maya region, which is right up here. This is the Yucatan Peninsula. Cancun is right there, if you've been to Cancun. And these sort of slate gray areas along the Caribbean seaboard here, Bay of Chetumal, Cebu Valley, Toledo District, Ulua Valley down here in Honduras, the famous Soconusco Coast over here. These are all prime cacao growing area. Cacao loves heat. It cannot tolerate frost at all. It needs a lot of water, so there has to be a lot of rainfall. It really prefers well-drained alluvial soils. And so these riverine areas that are along the Caribbean seaboard, and then this is where the Bay of Honduras here, where Columbus boarded the cargo canoe that was carrying cacao. Over here on the Pacific coast, on the Soconusco coast, we know that during the post-Classic times, the Aztecs from the highlands of Mexico City tried to control this area militarily, just to ensure that they had a steady supply of chocolate that was being quartered up to Mexico City so that they had chocolate drink. Now, I've been showing you places like Piedras Negras and Naranjo. I'm going to show you an image from Tikal up here. These areas are not really prime cacao growing areas. And I could also show you dozens of images of iconographic images of cacao from recent excavations up here at Chichen Itza that Peter Schmidt has done. That's not an area where you could really grow more than a couple of isolated cacao trees in these collapsed cenotes or riojadas, as they call them. And so, how did they get their cacao? Well, we know that we just talked about an instance of sort of military domination in order to extract cacao. So, getting cacao as tribute or taxation is one option. We know that during the late post-classic and early colonial times, the Itza, who were living out here in their island stronghold on Laguna Petén Itza, in the middle of the Petén, that they had established more or less estates down here in southern Belize to grow cacao. And they had very close relationships with them, and so they were pulling a lot of cacao from this area right here. So there seem to be a number of different options and ways that cacao could be moved around. I know you probably can't see these little figures, but these are porters who are carrying a trunk line loaded with cacao here and here. And then, of course, cacao, if there were rivers and sheltered areas, cacao could, of course, be moved via a big cargo canoe in particular. So we can think of then three ways, there probably are more, but let's just think about three of them tonight, three ways that the royal courts could ensure that they would be provisioned with cacao. And one would be to establish a colony in a cacao growing area, or trade for cacao with long distance traders, or acquire cacao through tribute or taxation. And we spoke of an example from the early colonial time where we know that the colony, kind of a colony or an estate in a far-flung location, we know that that was one strategy. The intimations that we have about Maya royalty and their interaction with traders is very interesting because every time the god El, who was the underworld deity of kind of patron of traders, is shown in classic times. He's often shown as kind of this lascivious old man. You see him right here, groping a young female, and he's always like someone who kind of flaunts the rules of good manners and doesn't really, kind of dresses in a very flamboyant fashion. And so we have this sense of a very conflicted relationship between the members of the Maya royal court, who were sort of like the old style aristocracy based on agricultural productivity, and a lot of their deities that they valued greatly were corn deity, and the hero twins were both planters and hunters, and so we see this real valorization of agriculture and agricultural productivity, and this kind of really keeping the traders at arm's distance. And so we don't know how much cacao was coming into these royal courts via traders. To a certain extent, they probably just had to deal with traders, but they seem to have not liked it. And then the third, of course, acquiring cacao through tribute or taxation, even though a decade or so ago, most of people first felt that there really wasn't a lot of economic information in the Maya hieroglyphs. And even still today, they're not like cuneiform from ancient Iraq, which my colleague used to, Paul Zemansky used to characterize as the first cash register receipts, because the cuneiform stuff is all about economic transactions, trading for sheep and wheat and things like that. So the Maya texts are not like that, but we're finding that there's actually a lot of information about the political economy that can be teased out of the text and the imagery, the iconography of the Maya area. So we'll take a look at a little bit of that. But first, let's take a look at an area in which it seems like the first two options probably represent, come closer to what was going on. So let's take a look now at a cacao-producing area over here in the sort of central, the little Caribbean country of Belize, a valley called the Sibun Valley. And if you go up the Sibun River, and it's highly navigable, so it's easy to commute right up it, you will see that there's a lot of orchards along the banks of the river. And orchards are doing a combination today of citrus and cacao. And then if you go far enough upriver, beyond Hell's Gate, where there's these big rocks, you'll come to a plant that's owned today by Hummingbird Citrus Limited, but it still has the old sign when it used to be owned by Hershey. And the Sibun River is a volatile river. It's characterized as the most volatile in Belize, with these wild overbank events during the growing season. And so it's the growing season coincides with the planting season. And so if you're a corn farmer or you grow beans or something, it's kind of a difficult valley to be growing plants in, because these overbank events are very frequent and they occur simultaneously with when the plants would be maturing. On the other hand, it's a great valley to grow trees in, to do orchard agriculture, because trees have these very sturdy root systems and the trunks, and a lot of orchard species can tolerate having their feet underwater for maybe a 24-hour period, which is often the case in the Sibun Valley. So we find that today, and I think in the past too, this was a valley in which orchard agriculture was the preferred and the most kind of successful kind of farming that could take place. So we spent some time, and actually Geraldine Hoffman, who is the outreach director of the Hoffman Record, which was responsible partly for the invitation to bring me here tonight. She worked on these sites in the Sibun Valley. She's one of my field school students at Boston University, where I used to teach in 1999. And you see an image, the blue line here is the Sibun River. It's a river valley survey, and the red circles are the archaeological sites that we found, the surface sites. And then you notice, you might be able to see there's a lot of pink triangles, and those represent cave sites. This is a very karstic region with a lot of cave visitation going on the south side of the river along here, and then up at the top of the river too. So I'm going to just show you some of the interesting results that we have from, and how contrasting the archaeological signatures, if you will, for a site here in the Upper Valley, a site in the Middle Valley, and then some sites that we've documented in the Lower Valley. They look all different. So in the Upper Valley, this is the site that was already on the books in Belmopan, the capital of Belize, as a site. It's called the Hershey site. So I'm not going to change the name. And it is true that the site, all around the site, is just a cacao grove, just nothing but cacao trees. And it was owned for a while by Hershey. And they planted some of the trees, but a lot of them were already there. You can see that the site, this is the main pyramid here, this is just the core of the site. And it has these two parallel mountains right here are a golf course that is just off the southeastern side of the main pyramid. This is a very K10 kind of pattern. You see this if you visit the site of Cacao. If you go up into the Belize River Valley, you see that the site of Anthropologist, these miniature golf courts that are kind of tucked in the shadow of the main pyramid. When we were doing some work exposing the eastern facade of this pyramid over here, we found this pottery sherd, which has the prefix of the emblem glyph, and it just has the top of the cross bands of Naranjo, the Naranjo emblem glyph. And so here's another example where we see the presence of a site from the west into Guatemala where it's not such great cacao growing country. And we see that here at the Hershey site. And so the architecture is sort of emulating the K10 to the west, where the royal courts are located. And then you see this emblem glyph also, which links us with the K10. And so the upper part of the valley seems to have been, if not established as a colony from the K10, was in a kind of a close relationship and was looking to the K10, emulating the architectural style of the K10. If we go down, on the other hand, I want to tell you one more thing. This is a little disturbing. As we began to excavate in there's two passageways that we excavated right here between the pyramid and these sort of platform structures where the main houses once stood. And there's another passageway over here. We found these deposits that at Tikal they call problematical deposits. And more recently, archaeologists have begun to call them termination deposits. And they're a mixture right below the surface. Sometimes architectural debris, like stones from architecture, are pushed down on top of them. And they have a lot of reconstructible pottery vessels, a lot of burned debris, and sometimes human remains too that are really disarticulated. And in this case, the human remains, the dentition that we found, you see these are file teeth, and we found another tooth with a jade inlay. So these are all individuals who were not commoners. They were members of probably perhaps a secondary elite who lived at this site. And this was in the passageway here. So there's something that went on at the end of the life of this site that it was a kind, in a way, it was the termination of the site that happened. And it was probably something fairly violent. It could be that the human remains come from despoiled ancestral tombs, because there appeared to be some tombs in the main pyramid that had been moved in antiquity a long time ago. So it could be that that's what they are, or something else. Where it's not, we're not able to be that conclusive about it. If we go down to the Caribbean end of the valley, closest to the Caribbean Sea, we find a site pattern that is completely different. And we find, instead of pyramids, instead of ball courts, we find these circular structures. And you can just see the outline of one here. There's the doorway. There's actually an earlier one that you can see the outline of that we've exposed here, here, and here. And they probably look something like this. They're not much more than about 6 meters in diameter. They're not really, they're not residential architecture, but they're not really monumental but we have 3 of them now in the valley, in the Sigun Valley, and they're known from other areas. They always date to the terminal classic period, and they're always located in these strategic places where either along a strategic waterway or in a place where there was some sort of strategic resource that might have been, that people might have been trading in or moving around or growing. And in this case, it seems probably likely that it was cacao. And so, and this kind of architecture is, these instances, they're beginning to crop up and be reported now in the P10, but they always come at the very end. There's one in St. Paul that is terminal classic. They're always terminal classic. So they seem to be speaking to something that is almost a repudiation of the P10, the nobility and the royal class and their privilege. So it's something very different that is coming in at the end of the classic and perhaps unsettling the patterns that were in place in the classic period. Finally, in the middle of the valley, at a site called Pacao, and because it's the middle of an orchard, you see that there's a citrus in this case. And here's one of the mounds of the site that has some higher bush on it. And here it is, the profile of it. You can see that we have an excavation unit that's actually going right to the middle of the axial trench, to the middle of the structure. And this particular burial we encountered, and this was an individual, terminal classic individual, as some kind of a secondary lord and cacao drinker, and perhaps a martial leader. And I'll tell you why I think that. First of all, you can see his lower legs here, and a number of pottery vessels associated with him, but they're not the cylindrical vessel form. It's a new form now. The form has changed again, and it's this pure form that seems to be the preferred cacao drinking vessel of the terminal classic. And Bill Ringgold and George Bay argued this a great length in a recent publication. And then on this shelf right here, and all of these pieces of carved bone, and this is human bone, it's portions of a human mandible and cranium, and you can see a carved kind of what we call the poke motif, or the weave motif, on the top of the skull, and then this is the area that's right between the eyes, the cock or smoke glyph right there, and then these are the 2 sides of the mandible with these canine and avian cartouches. You might be able to just make them out in this, and these are evocative of the warrior sodalities of the terminal classic times and into the post-classic times. And the warrior sodalities were a structure that was really very distinct from the traditional aristocracy of the classic Maya period. So once again, something different is coming in here and perhaps challenging and unsettling the aristocracies of old. The cock glyph right here suggests that, with the mat motif, suggests that this was an individual who might have been a kind of secondary lord, and the Yahalkak is a secondary lord title that is known. And so once again, very different burial than the kind of thing that we've been seeing earlier through the classic period to the west in the P10. So what's going on in the Sigun Valley then? We have one pattern that seems linked with the P10 to the west, where all the royal courts are located, many of them. And we have one pattern up here, and then a different pattern in the lower valley, and then this kind of intermediary thing with the secondary lord at the place called Pacao in the middle valley. So was the valley divided politically by Cacao, with this lower area perhaps being independent traders, and the upper area perhaps being an estate established by a place like Lowland to the west? These are all really distinct possibilities at this point in time. there's no clear evidence in this Moon Valley of tribute or taxation going from the valley into the Payten, although it certainly could have. We just don't have a lot of direct evidence of it. But we do have from the area within Guatemala itself, within the Payten, a site like Tikal, which was one of the largest, most powerful sites through the Classic period. We have scenes such as this, and this is a rollout from a cylindrical late Classic polychrome, and you can see that there's a lord sitting at the top on the throne here, and steps coming up to it. Some of the people are kneeling, and some are sort of on one knee making an offering. And this is a tribute presentation scene. And oftentimes when we have hieroglyphs on staircases, they often refer to some kind of martial event. And so there's usually some sort of conflict reference here. And this particular vessel is from the burial of a very famous ruler of Tikal by the name of Hisa Chankawil. And this may even be him shown here, sort of without all of his formal regalia, just he's just kind of relaxing on his throne, accepting the tribute that's being offered to him. And we'll come back to this image in a minute. Now, regarding the relationship between martial conflict and tribute, how would that work? There is this sort of prevailing story of why martial conflict took place in the Maya region, and the notion that you would take a captive and the captive would be sacrificed. And there is some evidence of captive sacrifice, but we also know that when, say, Spaniards came onto the scene and they started to fight indigenous peoples from Mesoamerica, they were not being killed. The object of warfare was not to kill them, it was to take them captive. And sometimes they would be sacrificed and sometimes not. But we're beginning to see that there are instances, and Sutton Martin and Mary Miller have pointed this out quite nicely. There are instances of rulers who weren't taken captive, they weren't killed, they weren't sacrificed, they were held captive for maybe 10 years, and then they were returned to their throne. And so during that time, they apparently were ransomed. So they were being held for tribute ransom. So it's beginning to look like Maya warfare was, although much earlier than European medieval warfare, it might have had similar rules of combat and similar kind of outcome, similar kind of goal, and that is not to kill the opposing party, but to take captive, especially high status individuals, who and then to demand a ransom for their eventual return. And this is just an example of this very thing, a royal lord, holy ruler, Kulahau, of Pelenge, Chitam II, who was taken captive by a place called Tomina and held captive for quite a while and then returned to his home kingdom. And this shows him. This is a carving from Tomina, from the site at which he was held captive. So this would be, you can imagine that this would be a very effective way of collecting tribute, of demanding tribute. The terms were probably negotiated. And there are what I call the paradigmatic 5 things that are demanding tribute or seen as tribute offerings. And these are quetzal feathers, these green iridescent feathers, jadeite that seem to have moved around in finished form, spondylus shells that are from, there's actually a Caribbean species, but a lot of them are Pacific species. It's a deep water shell, so it's challenging to get the beautiful pink color. It's a kind of thorny oyster, it's sometimes called. And cotton mantas, these big, oversized tribute mantas that you see these men wearing, and that are edged with a skyband feather edging. It's actually Steve Houston who has coined the term human tribute bundles for these individuals, and they were basically indicating the tribute that was being offered to, in this case, the ruler of a place called Cacao. So those are four, I said here you had five, but I've only shown you four things on this particular scene. What was the fifth? Well, you probably know, it was chocolate. It was cacao. And even though it isn't shown on the vessel from Tikal that I was just showing you, cacao presentation, tribute presentation is commonly shown in a lot of other places. But perhaps the most famous place is at Bonaparte. The murals of Bonaparte, and you see here a painting, a kind of rendering of those murals done by Heather Hurst and Wendy Ashby. And this is an end wall, and you know, Maya stone architecture, they used a Corbel vault, and so the end walls of the buildings were a steep inverted V shape in the interior. So this is a painting on the end wall, and you can see these white stacks here, and another white stack over here. And here's the cacao glyph, once again, and cacao rock, and then a bar for 5, and Steve Austin and David Stewart have argued that this is a symbol for peak, or 8,000, so that this is a reference to 40,000 cacao beans that were being delivered to the royal throne. And you can see the royalty sitting on their throne on the end wall here. And these cacao beans would have been perhaps brought from pretty far away, several days' journey at least. And then, on another wall, or actually in the same room, but the side wall, we see once again the fellows of the oversized tribute mantas wearing jadeite and quetzal feathers, and more of the human tribute bundles, perhaps, that we can see. This is the end of the wall, and then here's the beginning of the throne scene with all the cacao bundles just on the end wall. So we have the wearing and bearing of tribute very clearly spelled out in the Bonaparte murals, and cacao plays a central theme in that. And this cacao, as I mentioned, in a place like, well, Bonaparte is on the Usumacinta, so perhaps some canoe travel was possible, although there's many portions of that river that are not navigable. And so much of the cacao would have been brought to these royal courts, either via trunk line, where kind of a headband goes across the forehead and then supports a backpack, or sort of strapped onto these big cacastes or back racks that porters would wear. And this is actually another rendition of God, the underworld god of trade, and you can see that he's actually inspecting a cacao tree, and these are the cacao pods right here. So the central role of cacao, and I think we really, so it's very clear that looking to this area, we really see the very first connoisseurs of cacao. We see cacao drinking by 600 BC, and that's when we can pick it up as archaeologists, so it probably begins to occur even earlier than that. The scenes of women pouring cacao and the sort of the centrality of cacao and the presentation of cacao as part of the performance of royalty among these first connoisseurs of chocolate. Cacao provisioning clearly entailed some rather complex geopolitics that might not be so foreign from the way in which we acquire crude oil, for instance. Any kind of time we have a precious resource that we have a great appetite for, and we're acquiring it from afar. Some very complex geopolitics occur. And those geopolitics apparently were somewhat lacking in long-term sustainability, perhaps analogous again to the situation today. And so we see those networks collapsing see the abandonment of many of the royal courts of the Central Payten by about 8900. Although cacao drinking as a practice, it proved highly resilient and continues through to colonial times to the present day. So thank you very, very much. And I want to thank also National Science Foundation supported this research, Boston University International program, the Boston University Field School students, Gerald and Hoffman, one of them, and my graduate students who certainly did a lot of work on this. And I'd like to also acknowledge the late Bruce Collington, who is our project mechanic, and we will miss him sorely, and the government police. So happy Valentine's Day.
If anyone has a few questions, we could take them, and before we head over to Manning Hall. Yes?
Do the Mayans have any kind of speak to?
Yes, and honey was, they used honey. They were actually quite the apiaries. And sometimes honey would be added to chocolate. There's another beverage that's fairly common in the northern part of the Maya region among Yucatec Maya people called balche, and that has a lot of honey in it. So definitely sweets were consumed, so honey, but sugar was not present in the region before Europeans moved it from. Sugar comes from, I think, Southeast Asia originally. Yes.
Did people have some families or areas, regions have like special recipes that they always kept to, like certain regions always had a certain recipe?
Well, I think that Steve might have some interesting things to say about this too, that we often, I neglected to mention that there's often this kind of enigmatic, kind of cryptic descriptors that become before the word cacao on the glyph bands around the vessels. Peak cacao, or we don't know if it's tree fresh cacao or if it's cacao that's a reference to cacao from a particular area or a particular recipe for making cacao. So there's several different terms like that I'm sure do refer to either regional varieties of cacao or different ways of preparing it. And today, like the addition of black pepper, that's really something you can only see in the Toledo district of southern Belize. Cacao drink is still made a lot in the highlands of Guatemala, but they don't add black pepper to it. So you still see some regional distinctions in the way that the cacao drink is prepared.
Well, if there are no more questions here, why don't we adjourn to Manning Hall across the green. Thank you.